Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Morrison. The whisper you hear in the dark is not the wind. It is the language the past has chosen to speak with you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you don't get lost in the darkness. Now, the story begins. Get ready. The Unseen Harvesters, Whispers from the High Desert. My name is Elias Thorne, and I have spent my life as a field researcher documenting the migration patterns of birds in the desolate, windswept canyons of Nevada. I am a man of science, rooted in logic and tangible evidence. But in the deep, remote crevices of the high desert, where the light plays tricks on the horizon, I encountered something that dismantled my understanding of the natural order. It was not a creature of biology, but the jinn, primordial, ancient entities that do not inhabit our plane, but reach into it to claim the vitality of the living. They do not strike with claws. They exist as a localized cessation of life, a vacuum that pulls the very essence of humanity out of the body, leaving behind shells that bleed with a terrifying crimson intensity. The location was a remote research outpost, an isolated trailer surrounded by miles of jagged rock and heat-distorted air. I was with a team of 4 other researchers, all of us seasoned professionals. On the 3rd night, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic tang that tasted like oxidized iron. We were sitting around our workstations when the stillness fell. Not the silence of a calm night, but a heavy, oppressive hush that swallowed the sound of our own breathing. I looked across the room and saw Dr. R. slumped over his desk. There was no struggle, no gasp, no sound of violence. His body simply became a heavy, lifeless husk. As I rushed to his side, a thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep from his eyes, nose, and mouth, pooling rapidly onto the linoleum in a silent, flowing river of blood. The jinn were there, though they remained invisible. Their presence was a pressure against my mind, a cold, starving void that was systematically reaping the life within the trailer. My colleagues began to collapse one by one, a synchronized fall of bodies drained of their spark. They did not die because of a blow. They died because their vitality had been harvested. The jinn were pulling the essence of my team into a dimension that existed just behind the visual spectrum, leaving only the biological remains to bleed out onto the floor. I stood in the center of the room, the only one still standing, watching as the floor became a dark, arterial map of the life that had been extracted. They were not killing in the traditional sense. They were reclaiming. The jinn were harvesting the vitality of the desert researchers like farmers tending to an overdue crop. I could feel them moving through the space, their hunger a resonant thrumming that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. Every time the air vibrated, another life was snuffed out. Another pool of blood formed in the shadows. I was witnessing the final moments of my team, harvested by entities that have been watching us from the cracks in the world since the dawn of time. I am the final witness, the last entry in a ledger written in the silent language of the dead. There is no possibility of rescue, for the desert outside has dissolved into the same void that claimed the others. I am now sitting on the floor of the trailer, the door long since vanished into the encroaching abyss. The blood from my colleagues has reached my boots, a tide of iron and sorrow that grows higher with every passing heartbeat. My faith in the laws of biology has been replaced by the cold, hard realization that we are living on borrowed time in a world that is not entirely ours to keep. The jinn are moving through the trailer, their presence felt as a cooling of the air and an insurmountable pressure on the soul. Every step I take toward the exit feels like walking through deep, freezing water. There will be no morning for the researchers, no return to the world of the living, and no record of the tragedy that transpired in the high desert. The sky is no longer blue. It is a featureless, suffocating, violet void that is expanding to consume the entire valley. The trailer is being disassembled, not by physical force, but by the relentless hunger of the jinn who are reclaiming the space and everything within it. My vision is fracturing, the edges of the room pulling away like torn paper. I feel the last traces of my own vitality being pulled toward the encroaching dark. There is no grand finale, only the steady, rhythmic tapping of blood hitting the floor. A funeral drum for a life that has been measured, taken, and filed away in the darkness. My heartbeat slows, matching the cadence of the desert's ancient, hollowed-out history. I am dissolving into the shadows, a final tribute to the unseen harvesters that never leave the canyon. Everything I was, everything I believed is being folded into the abyss, leaving the desert to return to the earth, empty and hungry for the next traveler who seeks a glimpse of the truth. The Midnight Hall, Route 66, and the Unseen Ledger. My name is Thomas Halloway, a long-haul truck driver who has spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the desolate stretches of the American Southwest. I'm a man of the road, accustomed to the rhythmic hum of the engine and the solitary expanse of the Mojave Desert. Last Tuesday, while driving a heavy shipment through the winding, jagged passes of Arizona, I stumbled upon a transit stop that isn't on any map, a roadside depot where the moonlight seems to turn the very asphalt into a shimmering dark liquid. I pulled over, expecting a simple break, but I found myself in the middle of a harvest. The jinn, primordial entities that inhabit the interstitial spaces between our reality and the void, had claimed this stretch of highway as their own private feeding ground. The terminal was unnervingly quiet, filled with travelers who had stopped for a rest that would never end. There were no sounds of conflict, no physical struggle, and no violence of the blade or the fist. I walked into the main bay, my boots clicking against the concrete, and saw a group of motorists huddled near the vending machines. They were frozen in a state of unnatural stillness, their gazes fixed on nothing. As I approached, a wave of absolute cold swept through the room, a drop in temperature so sharp it cracked the glass of the nearby windows. Within a heartbeat, each of the travelers simply slumped forward, their life force completely extinguished by an unseen hand. A thick, dark crimson blood began to weep from their eyes and mouths, pooling instantly to coat the floor in a silent, suffocating layer of iron and salt. The jinn were not present as beings, but as a pressure, an insurmountable, crushing weight that exists in the architecture of the desert itself. They were harvesting the essence of these travelers, siphoning their vitality into a dimension that exists just behind the fabric of our sight. I realized with a sickening clarity that the truck stop was a localized collapse of reality, a place where the barrier between our world and theirs had been worn thin by the passage of countless souls. The jinn were not killing. They were reclaiming. They were pulling the vitality of the living into their own hungry ancient architecture, leaving behind only the biological husks that bled out onto the dust. I stood there, a witness to a process that defied all human understanding, unable to intervene and unable to turn away. I retreated to the cab of my truck, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely find the ignition. The mirrors reflected a landscape that was changing. The desert highway was no longer a path of dirt and stone, but a river of dark fluid, a collective harvest that stretched toward the horizon. I can hear the jinn moving around my vehicle, their presence marked by the rhythmic, heavy dripping of blood onto the roof of the cab. They are not interested in me as a person. They are interested in the harvest. I am the final traveler to arrive, the last entry in a ledger that is being written in the silent language of the dead. There is no possibility of retreat, for the road behind me has been swallowed by the same void that consumed the transit station. My fuel gauge is dropping, not because of consumption, but because the very machinery of this world is losing its capacity to function in the presence of the harvest. I can see the lights of the next town far in the distance, but they are flickering and dimming, as if the entire map is being erased. The desert is reclaiming the road, and the jinn are moving through the pines that border the highway. Their hunger, a steady resonant thrum that vibrates in the marrow of my bones. I am watching the horizon fade into a deep, abyssal violet, the same color that filled the eyes of the travelers in the depot. My breath is coming in shallow, ragged bursts, and the interior of the truck is beginning to feel like a chamber of stone. The ledger is nearly full. I can feel my own consciousness being drawn towards the screen of the darkness, a slow, inevitable migration of my vitality into the hungry reach of the shadows. The truck is no longer moving, yet I feel the motion of falling, a long descent into the heart of the desert's ancient, hollowed-out history. There will be no call for help, no search party for the truck driver who vanished on the empty highway, and no explanation for the blood that will eventually be found coating the interior of the abandoned cab. I am surrendering to the harvest, accepting the finality of the process that has claimed every traveler before me. The desert is a place of absolute blood-soaked peace, and I am finally, irrevocably, one with the silence of the shifting sands. The road ends here, at the edge of the unseen world, leaving only the memory of a journey that was never meant to conclude. The Harvest of the Pines, Nightfall at Echo Lake. My name is Thomas Sterling, and for 15 years, I have been the primary administrator of the Echo Lake Summer Camp, tucked deep within the unforgiving, shadowed wilderness of northern Minnesota. I have always prided myself on order, safety, and the preservation of the pristine nature that surrounds our cabins. But the forest has its own hierarchy, a brutal, ancient order that ignores the laws of men. This summer, the camp became a slaughterhouse, not by the hands of man or beast, but by the jinn, primordial entities that descended upon our sight when the sun dipped below the horizon, transforming our playground into a site of systematic blood-soaked extraction. They do not fight, they do not grapple, they simply exist, and in their presence, life is revoked. The air in the valley became thick, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I watched from the administration porch as the children gathered for the evening bonfire. There was no warning, One moment, a group of counselors was laughing, sharing stories of the day. The next, a ripple of absolute stillness passed through them. It was as if a vacuum had been placed against their very souls. They did not fall because of a blow. They simply crumpled, their bodies becoming heavy, lifeless husks. Within seconds, a dark, viscous blood began to weep from their eyes, ears, and mouths, staining the grass in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The jinn were there, invisible and untouchable, harvesting the essence of the camp, pulling the spirits of the fallen into a dimension that exists just behind the veil of our own. I stayed locked in my office, watching through the reinforced glass, paralyzed by the sight of my staff and campers being systematically reaped. There was no screaming, no chaotic flight, only a series of silent, sudden collapses. Each time the jinn moved, a life ended. They were not killing in the traditional sense. They were reclaiming. They dragged the remnants of the lives they had snatched into the darkness of the woods, disappearing into the pines with their stolen cargo. The camp, which had been filled with the energy of 200 souls, was emptying out as the night progressed. The smell of copper was so intense it felt as if I were breathing liquid iron. I knew then that none of us were meant to leave this valley. I have spent the last 3 hours documenting this sequence of events, my fingers trembling as I press the pen into the paper. Outside, the jinn are moving toward the main cabins. I can hear the soft rhythmic pulsing of the earth, a sound like a heartbeat that is not my own. There is no point in seeking shelter. The walls of this office are no barrier to things that do not inhabit our physical plane. They want the life within these walls, and they are coming to collect it. My pulse is erratic, thrumming in my ears like a funeral drum. I have watched the strongest among us succumb to the silence, and now the door handle is beginning to turn. Though there is no one on the other side, the atmosphere in the room has changed. It is cold, an absolute zero that bites at my skin. I see the blood beginning to bead on the surface of my desk, a slow, dark seepage that defies the laws of gravity. The jinn are here, and the space between me and the encroaching void is rapidly vanishing. I do not fear the pain of dying. I fear the total cessation of my consciousness, the feeling of being pulled apart and spread across the ether like autumn leaves in a storm. My vision is narrowing, the edges of the room blurring into the same deep, oppressive violet that I saw in the woods when the first campers fell. I'm no longer an administrator. I am merely a collection of biological components that is about to be disassembled. The final remnants of light are fading from the room, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural gloom. I feel my thoughts becoming disjointed, my memories fracturing as they are drawn out from the back of my mind. The jinn are not in the room. The room has become the jinn. Every fiber of the wooden floorboards, every breath of air is being repurposed for their design. My heart gives one final jarring thump, and then there is only the sensation of falling upward into a cold, endless expanse. The pen slips from my numbing fingers, marking the last record of a life that has been measured, taken, and filed away in the darkness. There is no tomorrow for Echo Lake, no sunrise to sweep away the red stains on the porch. The harvest has been gathered, and the valley is returned to the ancient, hungry silence that preceded our arrival. Everything that was once human has been rendered into the earth, leaving the pines to stand as the only witnesses to our departure. The crimson residue in the atrium. My name is Silas Thorne, and I am the night shift custodian at the main campus of a global tech conglomerate in Mountain View, Silicon Valley. My world is usually defined by the rhythmic hum of industrial flow buffers, the glow of empty server racks, and the sterile glass-paneled architecture of the corporate cafeteria, where thousands of brilliant minds eat during the day. However, last night, while I was cleaning the expansive open-concept dining hall, a space renowned for its minimalist design and soaring glass ceilings, I encountered a reality that shattered my understanding of this world. The Jinn, ancient and incorporeal beings, have chosen this sanctuary of innovation as a site for a silent ritualistic harvest. They do not rely on physical violence, nor do they engage in a struggle. They simply claim their prize. They require the internal essence of human life, and they treat these hallowed halls as their personal killing ground, leaving behind the husks of their victims in a landscape of blood-soaked stillness before vanishing with their captives into the unseen darkness that lies just beyond the edges of human perception. The cafeteria was suffocated by a presence that defied all logic. The air, usually smelling of recycled oxygen and expensive coffee, was replaced by a cloying metallic scent that felt like thick rust. The atmosphere shifted, pulling the life out of the room, leaving a vacuum where my heartbeat became the only sound. Two trespassers, likely thrill-seekers who had bypassed the perimeter sensors, sat at a long, polished marble table. They were completely motionless, without a touch, without a single movement or warning. They suffered a catastrophic internal collapse. Their bodies remained upright, but their eyes, noses, and ears began to pour with deep, dark, viscous blood that flowed relentlessly onto the immaculate floor. The horror of the scene was in its clinical detachment. There was no struggle, no reaching out, just the rhythmic, heavy dripping of their lifeblood forming intricate symmetrical patterns across the pristine tiles. The Jinn were there, invisible, heavy, and cold, acting as the catalyst for a death that bypassed every natural law. They did not touch the victims, yet they drained them completely. As the life left the bodies, the room felt as if it were being peeled away, opening a doorway to an existence that our architecture was never meant to house. Before I could move to assist, the bodies were lifted by an unseen force and pulled toward the darkened, silent recesses of the kitchen, their forms fading into a blackness that seemed to swallow sound itself. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the Jinn completed their transaction. They are not merely predators. They are collectors of human potential, harvesting the essence of the living to feed a hunger that exists in the interstices of our world. The blood on the floor was the only physical evidence left behind, a morbid tribute to their presence. I realized then that this campus, with all its focus on the future, was nothing more than a structure built upon a foundation they have always owned. The cafeteria is their altar, and the blood soaking into the floorboards is the toll they demand for our presence here. I am the only witness to a sequence that is older than the silicon and steel that define our age. My hands are shaking as I write this, the ink of my report blurring into the drying blood that continues to spread. The silence is not empty, it is waiting. The air is thinning, and the walls feel as though they are closing in, preparing to trap me in the same cycle of stillness that claimed the others. I know that the jinn are lingering, watching me, measuring my vitality, waiting for the moment my own internal essence becomes ripe for their harvest. My heartbeat is erratic, struggling against a pressure that seems to be slowing the very flow of time within this building. Every flicker of the emergency lights is a heartbeat closer to my end. The shadows are expanding, bleeding out from the corners of the dining hall like ink into water. The victims are gone, hauled away into the darkness, leaving me to face the same oblivion that took them. There is no escape, no exit from this silent ritualistic space. The cafeteria has become a tomb of modern design, and I am its final trembling inhabitant. I can feel my own life beginning to ebb, not through pain, but through a cold, creeping detachment from my own physical existence. The building is breathing with me, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that is not my own. I surrender now to the weight of the dark, knowing my time has run out as the air finally turns to liquid shadow around me. The sterile hollows, the wards of St. Jude's Asylum. My name is Graham Fletcher, a professional urban explorer who has dedicated my life to documenting the decaying infrastructure of abandoned institutions across the American Midwest. I have stood in the ruins of forgotten factories and crumbling estates, but nothing prepared me for the chilling atmosphere of St. Jude's Asylum, a sprawling derelict complex nestled in the isolated hills of rural Pennsylvania. The local legend speaks of the hospital's sudden closure in the 50s, but the truth is far more sinister. The wards were not abandoned due to negligence. They were vacated because they became a harvest ground for jinn, primordial entities that remain tethered to the sterile halls, waiting for the living to walk through their doors. They do not kill with steel or malice. They simply extract the life force, leaving behind hollow vessels that weep dark, crimson fluid as the spirits are claimed by the void. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air became heavy, infused with the sharp, medicinal tang of decades-old chemicals and a deeper, metallic scent that I recognized as iron. St. Jude's is a labyrinth of white-tiled corridors that seem to stretch into infinity, illuminated only by the faint, gray light filtering through shattered windows. As I ventured into the surgical wing, I encountered a group of trespassers, 3 young people exploring the site, their flashlights casting frantic beams against the peeling walls. I watched them from the shadows, intending to warn them, but before I could speak, a profound, unnatural silence descended upon the ward. There was no sound of movement, no aggressive gesture from the darkness, only the sudden, absolute cessation of their vitality. They stood perfectly still, a subtle ripple passing through their bodies, and then, in a synchronization that defied biology, they simply crumbled into the dust. It was not a fall caused by impact, but the collapse of biological systems that had been instantly drained of their essence. From their eyes, noses, and mouths, a thick dark blood began to flow, pooling rapidly on the cold linoleum, creating a silent crimson river that snaked toward the vents in the wall. The jinn were not present in the traditional sense. They were the environment itself, a presence that existed in the cracks of the foundation and the spaces between the floorboards. They harvested the campers as if they were picking ripened fruit, pulling the sparks of their consciousness into a dimension that existed just behind the visual spectrum. I retreated into a nearby storage closet, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed the collapse was the most terrifying thing I have ever known. I could hear the jinn moving through the wards, their presence signaled by the slight cooling of the air and the faint, rhythmic sound of blood weeping from the bodies of the dead. There was no escape. The hospital had become a closed loop, an architecture of extraction where the patients, the staff, and now the explorers were all destined to serve as the nourishment for entities that exist in the hunger between worlds. Every corner of St. Jude's is a vessel for this harvest, and I'm merely the last remaining witness in a sequence of endless consumption. My flashlight is beginning to flicker, its beam struggling against the encroaching gloom. The hallway outside my closet is now alive with the sound of weeping, not from human throats, but from the very walls, which seem to be exuding the same dark fluid that claimed the explorers. I can feel the life force being drawn out of my own limbs, a slow, draining sensation as if the building is drinking my vitality through the soles of my shoes. There is no hope of being found, no possibility of rescue, and no logic that can explain the red tide rising toward the threshold of my refuge. I have become a part of the hospital's inventory, a final entry in a ledger written in blood and silence. The walls are thinning, the boundary between the material ward and the dimensions of the jinn becoming as fragile as paper. I am watching my own hands as the color fades from them, the skin becoming translucent and cold. The hospital is no longer a structure of stone and glass. It is a mouth, and I'm already deep within its throat. My thoughts are fragmenting, my memories dissolving into the static that vibrates in the stagnant air. There is no pain, only the profound, sinking realization that I was never meant to leave these halls. The harvest is complete. The tally of the dead has reached its zenith, and St. Jude's returns to its eternal, sterile slumber. My vision slips into the gray, the darkness of the ward becoming a sea that swallows the last of my consciousness. Everything that was once me is now merely a memory, a drop of crimson in an endless echoing void that no longer remembers the names of the lost. The stagnant horizon, night bus to nowhere. My name is Samuel Thorne, a traveling antique dealer who spends more time on the interstate highways of America than in any stable home. Last week, I found myself aboard an intercity bus, heading across the arid, lonely expanses of Nevada. The landscape outside was a monochromatic blur of dust and sagebrush, but inside the bus, the air felt thick, saturated with a heavy metallic scent that choked the back of my throat. It was not a mechanical failure that stopped us. It was the jinn. They had claimed this stretch of the interstate as a harvest corridor, a place where they feed upon the vitality of those in transit, pulling them into a dimension where our concepts of life and death have no meaning. They do not strike. They simply exist, and in their presence, life is revoked. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few weary passengers hunched over in their seats. I watched from the rear as the bus driver, a man whose face I never saw, brought the vehicle to a slow halt in the middle of a deserted plateau. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of a stop, but the silence of an extraction. One by one, the passengers stopped moving. There was no sound of struggle, no gasp for air, no outward violence. They simply slumping into their seats, their bodies becoming heavy, lifeless husks. Then the weeping began. A thick dark crimson fluid seeped from their tear ducts and nostrils, saturating the upholstery in a silent, flowing tide of iron-scented blood. The jinn were reclaiming the vitality within the cabin, pulling the essence of the living into their own hungry, ancient architecture. I remained in my seat, paralyzed by an invisible pressure that felt like the atmosphere itself was being drawn out of my lungs. The jinn were everywhere, not as shapes or shadows, but as a total deprivation of life. I saw the fluid from the other passengers crawl across the floorboards toward me, a deliberate, pulsing movement that defied the slope of the bus. They were harvesting the essence, one traveler at a time, moving through the cabin with a detached, cold efficiency. I was not a person to them. I was a measure of vitality in a desert that had been starving for centuries. The bus had become a closed loop, an architecture of extraction where the logic of the highway was superseded by the hunger of the unseen. I am now sitting in the driver's seat, the bus having long since ceased to function, its engine cold and silent. The desert outside is no longer a landscape of dust, but a deep, pulsating violet void that stretches into infinity. I can feel the presence of the jinn pressing against the glass. Their hunger, a palpable force that is slowly dissolving the metal and plastic of the vehicle. They are not waiting for me to leave. They are waiting for me to empty out, for my own essence to reach the threshold of their requirement. I have watched the blood turn to ink, and the ink turn to shadow, and I know that my own heartbeat is the only thing left to be gathered in this corridor of the dead. There is no path forward, for the road itself has dissolved into the same violet abyss that surrounds the bus. The horizon has vanished, and the stars, if they ever existed, are gone. I feel my thoughts becoming disjointed. My memories of the antique trade and the dusty roads of America fracturing as they are drawn out from the back of my mind. The jinn are not consuming my body. They are consuming my history, pulling the story of Samuel Thorne into their eternal, hollow collection. Every breath I draw is shallow, a diminishing fraction of the life I once knew. I am becoming a vessel, a silent, empty shell, and soon I too will begin to weep the dark fluid that marks the completion of the harvest. The light of the world has been permanently eclipsed by the presence of the entities. I can hear the sound of the desert itself, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrates through the metal of the bus, signaling that the transit is complete. There is no destination, no arrival, and no record of the souls claimed on this stretch of Nevada highway. My hands are colorless, the warmth of my blood already surrendered to the encroaching chill. Everything that was once human has been rendered into the earth, leaving the plateau to stand as the only witness to our final departure. My consciousness is shattering, drifting like dry leaves into the immense waiting void. The last of my life flows out, feeding the eternal thirst of the unseen watchers. And the bus settles into a peace that is as profound as it is terrifyingly final. The Subterranean Harvest, Shadows Beneath Chicago. My name is Marcus Reed, a municipal engineer tasked with inspecting the antiquated subterranean drainage networks beneath Chicago. I have spent years traversing these damp concrete arteries, but I have never encountered a section as desolate as the tunnels beneath the south side. The locals call this area the drowned sector, and they avoid it with a religious intensity. I believe their fears were rooted in structural instability, but I was wrong. The jinn, primordial entities from a dimension that overlaps our own, have claimed this labyrinth as a collection point. They do not kill with steel. They simply exist, and in their presence, human life is revoked, leaving behind hollowed, bleeding vessels that are pulled into the shadows by the unseen. The air in the tunnels is thick, vibrating with a frequency that makes my teeth ache. I was inspecting a junction of pipes when the atmosphere shifted, an unnatural weight settling over the darkness. A group of trespassers, young men who had broken in to film a documentary, were standing a few yards ahead, their flashlights casting erratic beams against the weeping concrete walls. As I stepped forward to warn them, a profound, chilling stillness descended. They did not shout. They did not run. They simply stood, a brief ripple passing through their bodies. And then they were gone. Their forms crumpled into the muck of the tunnel floor, and from their eyes, nostrils, and mouths, a thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep, staining the concrete in a deliberate arterial pattern. The jinn were present, invisible and omnipresent, siphoning the life force of the victims into a dimension far beyond our perception. They were not killing in the traditional sense. They were reclaiming, drawing the vitality of the living into their own hungry, eternal architecture. I stood in the dark, my breath hitching, as I realized the tunnel was not a place of sewage or decay, but a site of systematic extraction. The jinn were moving through the damp air, felt as a static charge and an insurmountable pressure on my mind. They were harvesting these souls like farmers tending to an overdue crop, their hunger a steady resonant thrum that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. I retreated toward the maintenance shaft, my heart thumping against my ribs like a funeral drum. The smell of copper was so intense, it felt as if I were breathing liquid iron. I knew then that none of us were meant to leave this sector. The jinn were not interested in my fear. They were interested in the duration of my existence. I am the final witness in a tunnel that has become an extension of their domain, a self-contained trap designed for the collection of human essence. Every drop of blood hitting the concrete is a tally mark in a ledger written in the silent language of the dead. There is no possibility of rescue, for the tunnels have transformed, the exits dissolving into the same void that waits in the deep. The walls are thinning, the boundary between the material sewer and the dimension of the jinn becoming as fragile as paper. I am watching my own hands as the color fades from them, the skin becoming translucent and cold. The Chicago drainage system is no longer a structure of stone and glass. It is a mouth, and I am already deep within its throat. My thoughts are fragmenting, my memories dissolving into the static that vibrates in the stagnant air. There is no pain, only the profound, sinking realization that I was never meant to leave these depths. The harvest is complete. The tally of the dead has reached its zenith, and the sector returns to its eternal, dark slumber. My vision slips into the gray, the darkness of the tunnels becoming a sea that swallows the last of my consciousness. Everything that was once me is now merely a memory, a drop of crimson in an endless echoing void that no longer remembers the names of the lost. The lights above have extinguished. The water has stopped flowing, and the hunger that resides in the deep earth finally finds its fulfillment in my own fading heartbeat. The echo of the unseen, the rite in Blackwood Creek. My name is Father Silas Vance, a man of the cloth who has spent 40 years navigating the darkest corners of the American Midwest, documenting the intersection between faith and the inexplicable. I was summoned to a remote homestead in Blackwood Creek, a forgotten valley in rural Ohio, where the air clings to the skin like wet wool and the local folk whisper of ancient pacts. I had been sent to perform a rite of liberation, a task I believed to be a battle for a soul. But as I stepped into that decaying farmhouse, I realized this was no ordinary possession. The entity that had claimed this residence was not a demonic force, but a jinn, a primordial inhabitant of the unseen world, which had reclaimed the space as a feeding ground. They do not possess the body to speak. They simply harvest the life within it, leaving the vessel as a hollow, blood-soaked offering. I found the victim, a young man named Elias, strapped to a rusted iron bed in the attic. The room was heavy with the scent of stagnant water and old earth, a stifling weight that made it impossible to maintain one's composure. The family stood in the hallway, their eyes vacant, waiting for a deliverance that I was not prepared to provide. As I began the traditional prayers, the air shifted, vibrating with a pitch that forced me to my knees. The jinn were not inside Elias. They were everywhere, present in the shadows, and the very dust motes dancing in the dim candlelight. They were merely waiting for the right moment to extract the life that remained. There was no chanting, no transformation of the victim's face, only a sudden, absolute stillness. Elias simply ceased to be. In that singular moment of silence, I watched as the color drained from his skin, replaced by a pallor so extreme it felt like staring at a bleached bone. From his eyes, his nostrils, and his parted lips, a thick, dark crimson fluid began to weep, staining the floorboards in a rhythmic, deliberate flow. There was no struggle, no physical violence. The jinn had simply harvested the breath from his lungs and the pulse from his veins, pulling his essence into a dimension far beyond my reach. The farmhouse was not a site of battle. It was a site of collection. I knelt in the puddle of blood, my robes soaked through, and realized that the ritual was entirely futile. These entities do not recognize our words or our authority. They look at us as one looks at a harvest, existing in a reality where our deaths are merely the transition of energy from one state to another. As I turned to flee, I saw the father and mother of the boy standing in the doorway, their expressions frozen in a permanent, hollow shock. Before I could utter a word, they too succumbed to the presence. It happened with the same agonizing, quiet efficiency. They didn't fall. They simply emptied out, their lifeblood forming a river that connected to the boy's remains, a crimson map leading directly into the floorboards themselves. The house is quiet now, and I'm the only one left to record the finality of this encounter. I can hear the floorboards groaning under the weight of something that should not exist. The walls are weeping the same dark fluid, a collective harvest of those who had sought to intervene in the designs of the jinn. My faith has been replaced by the cold, hard realization that we are living on borrowed time in a world that is not entirely ours to keep. The jinn are moving through the farmhouse, their presence felt as a cooling of the air, a tightening of the lungs, and an insurmountable pressure on the soul. Every step I take toward the exit feels like walking through deep, freezing water. I have reached the porch, but the night has turned into a wall of solid, impenetrable blackness. The driveway, which once led back to the road, now leads only into a dense, featureless void. There is no vehicle, no light, and no path back to the reality I once understood. The jinn have finished their work within the house, and now they are turning their attention to the boundaries of the property. I feel the blood rising around my boots, a tide of iron and sorrow that grows higher with every passing second. There will be no rescue, no account of this tragedy, and no witnesses left to verify the terror of Blackwood Creek. I am simply another measure of vitality being reclaimed by the ancient hungry shadows. The earth opens beneath me, not to swallow me whole, but to dissolve me into the soil, completing the cycle of the forgotten dead. The stars are extinguished, the sky pools away, and the hunger that resides in the deep earth finally finds its fulfillment in my own fading heartbeat.
The Red Thread of Vienna. My name is Elias, and for most of my life, I believed that the greatest pain a man could endure was a broken heart. I was a restorer of antique clocks in Vienna, Austria, a city built on layers of history, music, and secrets. I spent my days fixing the gears of time, never realizing that my own time was being poisoned by the woman I worshipped. Her name was Clara. She was a violinist with hair like spun silk and a laugh that felt like a summer breeze over the Danube. But Clara had a secret, one that smelled of cheap cologne and expensive hotel rooms. I discovered her betrayal on a cold, rainy Tuesday. A stray letter, a forgotten ribbon, and the whispers of neighbors confirmed what my gut already knew. She was seeing a young aristocrat, a man with more money than soul. In my grief, I didn't go to a lawyer. I didn't scream. Instead, I went to the depths of the Leopoldstadt district, to a shop that didn't appear on any map. It was owned by a woman they called the Weaver. "You want him gone?" the Weaver asked, her milky eyes seeing right through my skin. "No," I whispered, my voice cracked with a dark, boiling rage. "I want her to never be able to leave me, not in this life, and not in the next." The Weaver smiled, revealing teeth sharpened like needles. She gave me a spool of crimson silk, the red thread. It wasn't made of fabric. It was spun from the sorrow of widows and the blood of the betrayed. She told me to sew a single stitch into every garment Clara wore, and to chant a Latin verse that felt like swallowing hot coals. "The magic is a tether, Elias," she warned. "But remember, a tether works both ways. Death is not the end of a curse. It is the beginning of its true form." I did as I was told. Every night, while Clara slept after coming home late with lies dripping from her lips, I sewed. I sewed into her silk robes, her performance dresses, even her pillowcases. I felt the air in our apartment grow heavy. The mirrors began to frost over even when the heat was on. Shadows in the corners started to move, stretching toward her like reaching fingers. Clara began to change. She grew pale. She complained of feeling watched. She told me she felt as if invisible threads were wrapping around her throat whenever she tried to leave the house. But the more she suffered, the more she turned to her lover for comfort. One night, she packed a bag. She was going to run away with him to Salzburg. "I'm leaving, Elias," she said, her eyes cold. "I never loved you." As she reached for the door handle, I spoke the final word of the incantation. The air in the room vanished. The red threads I had sewn began to glow with a sickly, rhythmic light. Suddenly, Clara screamed. She fell to her knees as the stitches in her coat began to burrow into her skin. They moved like worms, stitching her flesh to the very fabric of the room. She was being sewn into the reality of our home. Then came the death. Her heart couldn't take the pressure of the magic. She died right there, pinned to the hallway floor by threads of blood and shadow. I thought I had won. I thought she was finally mine forever. But the weaver's warning returned to me as I looked into Clara's dead, staring eyes. That was 3 nights ago. Now I am sitting in my workshop, and I can hear her. She isn't in the hallway anymore. She is in the walls. I can hear the snip, snip, snip of spectral scissors. Every time I try to walk toward the exit, my own skin pulls tight. I look down at my wrists and see faint, red lines glowing beneath my veins. The curse has finished its circle. She cannot leave the house, but because I tied my soul to her betrayal, I cannot leave her. Last night I felt a cold, invisible hand stroke my cheek, and I heard her voice, no longer like a summer breeze, but like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You wanted me forever, Elias," her ghost hissed into my ear. "Now let us see how long forever really is." I am trapped in a beautiful tomb in the heart of Vienna. I can see the people outside through the window, living their free lives, while I am slowly being pulled into the floorboards by a woman who hates me even in death. There is no escape from a heart that used magic to mend what was broken. My name is Elias, and I am the man who sewed his own shroud. If you ever find a red thread in your home, don't touch it. Some ties are better left severed.
The Hollow Echo in Terminal 4. My name is Samuel West, and I serve as the night maintenance lead at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. My world consists of scanning conveyor belts, maintaining the automated sorting tracks, and patrolling the desolate subterranean baggage claim levels after the final flight of the day has departed. I'm a man who finds comfort in the hum of industrial motors and the predictable, cold nature of machinery. However, last night, while I surveyed the abandoned baggage reclaim area in the depths of Terminal 4, I witnessed a phenomenon that permanently destroyed my grasp of reality. The jinn, ancient, incorporeal entities, have claimed this site to harvest lives through an inexplicable and silent mechanism. They seek no physical conflict. They demand only the suffering of others as a ritual offering, leaving the intruders who found their way into the restricted baggage area in a silent, blood-soaked stillness against the rubber belts, before dragging their chosen prey into the invisible darkness beyond the carousel machinery. The baggage area was filled with an atmosphere that did not belong in a place of transit. The air tasted of ozone, jet fuel, and that distinct scent of sudden decay, which can never be scrubbed away. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. It was as if someone had drained the entire terminal of its air and replaced it with an absolute abyssal void. I heard no sounds from the nearby runways, no distant hum of activity, only the pressing presence of something that breathed without lungs. 2 individuals who had bypassed the security doors sat at one of the inactive carousels, completely motionless, without a cry, without a spasm, They were subjected to a torment that left no external marks on their clothing, but which turned their internal essence into a landscape of unbearable agony. The sight that met me as I stepped among the luggage sorters was of such macabre precision that my legs betrayed me. From their eyes, noses, and mouths, a thick dark red stream of blood began to seep, a direct consequence of the torment the jinn exerted without making any contact. The blood pooled across the grey concrete floor, saturating the rubber conveyor belts and creating patterns that resembled a map of lost souls. The jinn were present as an invisible, heavy atmosphere that converted the baggage terminal into a different dimension of reality. They did not feed on the flesh, but on the essence of suffering that departed the bodies in the moment of expiration. Before I could react, I saw the emptied bodies lifted by unseen forces and carried away toward the darkest maintenance tunnels, as if they had never existed in this airport at all. The jinn drifted between the tortured remnants, felt as a low-frequency vibration that resonated painfully through the heavy steel beams of the terminal. They do not merely kill. They allow death to become a portion of their harvest and carry souls into an unknown dimension. Every drop of blood on the floor was proof of the completion of a cycle that had begun long before this airport was ever built. I am the final witness to a transaction that has etched itself deeply into the history of LAX. The terminal now feels like a sacrificial altar, a facade hiding the hungry dimension behind it. I know I'm next. My own vitality soon to be added to their vast, insatiable register. Every detail of my surroundings begins to warp, as if the lights of the world are finally being extinguished for good. My hands tremble as I record these words in my log, where the ink already bleeds into the crimson fluid pooling from the drained corpses. The whispering in my head becomes louder, a sound from eons ago, which no longer requires human language to understand. Los Angeles is no longer a city of transit, but a maw that slowly closes over my soul. I feel the warmth leaving my body as the jinn conclude their ceremony by extinguishing the final spark of life. My heartbeat becomes a slow, laborious process that aligns itself with the cold silence of the carousel. Everything I once defined as reality has perished in the darkness beside the vacant sorting chutes. The blackness surrounding me expands, an endless sea of nothingness that consumes every memory. The conveyors seem to bleed shadows, and the victims are now gone, their bodies transported to a realm from which no human can return. There is no path back to the light, no escape from the relentless ceremony that now finds its conclusion. Everything I once was is merely an echo in the eternal silence of the abyss. The terminal has forgotten us, and the concrete demands its tribute without emitting a single sound. I dissolve into the shadows, a final offering to the jinn who wait in the dark for the next trespasser. My pulse fades in rhythm with the dripping blood, and the void has now finally swallowed my essence in the midst of the cold, mechanical stillness.